Archiver is made possible with a grant from Humanities Kansas.
Here for CBS Reports is Charles Kuralt.
We begin this episode on May 21st, 1968 at 9 p.m. Central Time.
Hunger is hard to recognize in America. We know it in other places, like Asia and Africa. But these children, all of them, are Americans, and all of them are hungry. Hunger is easy to recognize when it looks like this. This baby is dying of starvation. He was an American. Now he is dead.
CBS just showed millions of people, a baby dying. No matter what else you see on TV today, you would never see that. But the documentary Hunger in America was about to profoundly change how the U.S. government dealt with hunger. It would also help solidify Bob Dole's moderation. No longer the Kansas againster, as the Salina Journal called him, but rather he was becoming more of a statesman, as the man from Russell eyed much bigger political prizes. The podcast is Archiver, The Man from Russell, Episode 5, The Move to the Middle, me. I'm your host, Sam Zeff. Dole's move to the middle certainly didn't start with a CBS documentary that looked at hunger among Latinos in San Antonio, poor whites in Virginia, Native Americans in New Mexico, and blacks in Alabama. By the time it aired in May 1968, Dole's election to the Senate was looking good. He ended up getting 60% of the vote against attorney William I. Robinson from Wichita. But Dole's moderation really started 2 years earlier when he was still in the House. I want to bring in archiver historian Virgil Dean now and ask, when do you think Bob Dole started to, in the eyes of perhaps the rest of the country, start to moderate?
Clearly, in the eyes of some of his former Kansas critics even, in the late years of his time in the House. In 1966, after he wins re-election, actually it's before the election, the Salina Journal, which is very critical. It's one of the Harris chain of papers which were constantly doing battle with, as far as Dole was concerned. They were constantly trying to defeat him throughout his early career, and were very critical, at least certain editors were. But the Salina Journal talks about how Dole was coming into his own, becoming more mature in his attitude towards government and not quite as edgy.
As he moderates, Dole even considered a primary challenge of incumbent Kansas Senator Jim Pearson in 1966. Pearson was part of the liberal wing of the GOP. He was close friends with his University of Virginia Law School classmate Bobby Kennedy. Pearson was part of the coalition that reduced the number of votes needed to block a Senate filibuster so civil rights legislation could pass. But Dole decided his political future was safer where he was in 1966, and he would make the most out of what would turn out to be his last 2 years in the House.
Nearly 500 million human beings, 1/7 of the human race, today face the threat of the worst famine this century. 5 million Indians may die of hunger this year, and by the end of the year, there'll be another 12 million mouths to feed. This is a measure of the task shouldered this morning by a woman. In Delhi this week, Mrs. Gandhi talked to Gerald Seymour.
It's a challenge which has to be faced and met. And I don't think it's a desperate situation by any means, but it does need tremendous unity in the country and a very determined effort to solve these various problems. And of course, you know that the situation has been complicated by the great drought we had this year. That was one of the reasons for the food shortage.
How serious is this food shortage going to be in the spring?
That's how the BBC reported the famine in India on January 19, 1966. Turns out, very serious. By the end of the year, President Johnson had dispatched a 4-member bipartisan congressional delegation, among them Bob Dole. When they returned, they wrote to Agriculture Secretary Orville Freeman requesting the U.S. send 1.8 million tons of grain to India under the Food for Peace program. Dole was perhaps the harshest critic of Freeman in the House over ag policy he considered too controlled by Washington, and over the Billy Saul Estes scandal that we talked about in Episode 3. But they buried the hatchet long enough to get the aid to India. It's hard not to give away the capital when you see people starving, Dole told the Wichita Eagle when he returned. But even before his trip to India, Dole had been thinking about hunger. At the end of 1965, Dole proposed the Bread and Butter Corps, an idea that would send Americans abroad to help developing countries with agriculture. Sounds a lot like the Peace Corps that Dole opposed, saying it sounded like a 2-year paid vacation overseas for young people. But in the Bread and Butter Corps, he saw benefits for ag schools like Kansas State. It was, Dole said, a farmer-to-farmer type program. Hunger, says longtime Dole aide Kim Wells, is something he would return to often.
This is one of those issues where the Republicans generally say, we want to help the needy but not the greedy. That was a sort of a Republican catch line. I said, this may be a good issue to get involved with because there is a need, there's no question, the way the economy was going. And he didn't hesitate. He said, that's a good idea. And then long after I quit working on it, he continued to work with Senator McGovern, Senator Kennedy on those issues, and even the worldwide hunger issues. And I think that came from the heart. There was no big political advantage to him doing that.
So the man from Russell moved to the middle and got himself elected to the Senate in 1968. In an editorial after the election, the Topeka Daily Capital said Kansas chose well, that Dole had a winning personality and a devotion to duty. But his next election would be the toughest of Dole's congressional career. He hired a notorious Republican dirty trickster who's still in the news, and he would change Kansas politics, and to a degree national politics, forever.
The state fair debate is significant because of one moment in that debate.
One moment. That's in our next episode of Archiver, The Man from Russell. Archiver is produced by Virgil Dean and Scott Richardson in the studios of KCUR 89.3 in Kansas City. Archiver is made possible with a grant from Humanities Kansas and is a production of Do Good Productions, where Gene Johnson is executive producer. Thanks to the staff at the Dole Institute at the University of Kansas. I'm Sam Zeff, and I'll see you on the next Archiver.